Hey everyone, today we're going to take a look at the Roland MC-303 Groovebox. This Groovebox has got one small problem, which is the volume potentiometer is actually broke. These are very prone to impact on the model. All through the Groovebox series of pieces of gear, the MC-505 has got the same problem. The problem is to replace the potentiometer for this volume control, you pretty much have to take the entire unit apart. So while I'm doing this to replace that pot, I'm going to kind of do a mini teardown of it. We'll take a look inside, see what components Roland has in there to make this thing work, and really just take a close, in-depth look at it. So the MC-303 was the first of Roland's Groovebox line of equipment. This one came out in 1996. So it's around the same era as the Roland XP synthesizer started coming out, right after the JV series of synths. And there's a lot of similarities in it in build construction. That is, the buttons on it are the exact same buttons that you find on the JV80. Same light-up pattern and everything. So they're probably the same micro switches, which I've had to replace in a couple of my pieces of gear. Along in this family, later came the MC-505, which is basically this 303 with a little bit more functionality, a little bit more buttons on there. Classic Roland gear has kind of had the same issue where they pack a lot of features and a lot of functionality into a small box, and it is really quite unintuitive to use, to really master the gear. So just to sit down with it and play with it, sure, it's fine, but if you really want to get to know it, and really, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of features packed into here, and it takes a little bit of time getting used to it. It's not difficult, you just need to spend the time and master it. So when they made the 505, they made it a little bit more user-friendly, a lot more functions that weren't buried deep in menus and things like this. And then there was other pieces of Roland gear in the same family too. Later out came out the MC-808 and 909, kind of playing a play on their classic gear in the TR series and the TB series for that matter, at least in terms of the numbers. What I really like about this unit is the fact that it's got the TR 808 and 909 drum machine samples built into it. So there's no actual synthesis going on in this device. It's all sampled playback, but the samples are pretty good, especially for the time when this came out. You can get these now pretty cheap on eBay. They're definitely floating around for under $100, typically in not perfect condition. They'll have some scratches, some wear. A lot of times you'll see them, the white keys in the front here will be kind of turned yellow, either from smoke or from UV damage. I'm not really sure what. But really pristine ones will go for upwards of $200, but it's still quite a deal compared to the $700 US listing price when they were released in 1996. And even though it is a little bit dated, there's a lot better piece of gear out there, especially on the software side of things world now. But this is still a fun box to play with, just to mess around with, and I find a lot of the samples in there still very usable. So the repair on this is going to be pretty trivial. It's just going to be simply replacing this potentiometer for the volume control, which, as you can probably see, it's a little bit loose on there. It's moving around. The problem with these is that these potentiometers are not panel mounted. They're strictly board mounted. So they're very susceptible to damage for anything that may bump into it, or you drop something on it. Any type of hard pressure on there will break these. Typically the pots break themselves, they don't break the board, but they are still, you have to dig down into it to get to it. So replacing this will be the task that I've had today. Now I've already looked up ahead of time the potentiometer I need for this, and the potentiometer specifically I need is made by a company called Alps, which I'll show here. It's a dual 10K pot, so they are pushing audio through this left and right channel, and it is part of their RK09 series. Mouser does carry these, and in single quantity they're $1.65. I ordered one ahead of time just so I don't need to wait making this video for the part to come in. I can just complete the repair while I have it apart without having to sit around on my bench for a couple days for that. So build construction's pretty good. The entire chassis is made out of metal, which is pretty nice, both top plate and the bottom plate. There's nothing holding the sides on, so the sides are a little bit flimsy. You can kind of push on them there because there's no reinforcements there. But overall, it does feel really good. All the buttons have a nice solid feel to them. Nice click. They're using the same micro switches that a lot of Roland gear at the time uses. The display is kind of annoying. The Charlie plexin they're using to actually light up all the 7-segment displays on there is very visible. It's not a very high refresh rate, so with my eyes I can catch it flickering quite a bit. I know on camera it's really bad, so the refresh of the camera is catching it quite a bit there. Not a big deal, just kind of an annoyance. Other than that, besides the fact that they don't panel mount potentiometers, it's a pretty reliable, pretty rugged piece of gear. on the back side, you've got MIDI in and out. You've got your external pedal control if you want. Left, right stereo jacks, your phone's jack, a low boost knob actually on there. And then the power supply is just a simple DC 9-volt external transformer. They do put this cute little strain relief on here though, just so you can make sure you don't plug the thing accidentally by tripping over the cord or something like that. So next we'll open it up and start tearing it apart so we can get to that pot. All the knobs are going to have to come off in this, so I'm just going to pull them off now. They're all identical, so there's no ordering you need to worry about or anything like that. I typically like to lay it on something soft too, just so I don't scratch any of the front panel while you're working on it. It comes apart simple. There's 8 screws at the bottom that hold it together. And then the cover lifts off. So there's 3 basic boards in here. You have your analog board that drives all your external connectors. I mean, there's some digital on here too, because you have your MIDI interface as well. Besides that, you've got your main digital board, which actually rides on top of this front panel board here, which houses all your buttons. And that's what we need to get to, because in the very back here, on this side is actually, is where that potentiometer is I need to replace. So we'll start by pulling all the screws off the back so we can get this first analog board off. So here's the first analog board, and doesn't look like there's a DAC on this board. There's a couple op amps and 7404, probably part of the MIDI interface there. Alright, so I guess it's on the main board in this unit. Pop these connectors off so I can get this out of the way. There's no need to remove the digital board from the main board, so I'll just leave that attached. I believe we'll probably just pull the screws off here to lift the front panel off. Well, they buried a screw, so I am going to have to take this board off, which is unfortunate. There's actually 4 screws buried underneath that board. Alright, so once all those screws are off, the board should just lift up and out. Actually, there's one thing I did forget. So on the front, this knob comes off, and then there's a knob that you need to remove. Once that's off, then the board just lifts up and out. And that's what it looks like. So this you want to be careful with, because all these buttons just rest in here. And if you drop this or flip it over, they're all going to go flying. So just set this aside in a safe place where you're not going to bump it. Alright, so here's the main input panel board, and this right here is the pot that's broke. You can actually see it kind of separating there. So If you really wanted to, you could probably disassemble this and reassemble it back together, but at this point it's just easier to replace it with the new one. And it looks like it is identical. So we will replace it. So this is the pot right here. I've mentioned this before in other videos about using solder wick. I just prefer solder wick. I think it's a more effective way of removing components from boards. And granted, if you have a lot of things to do, a lot of components to remove, especially ICs and stuff like that, a vacuum desoldering station is the way to go. I've got an older Weller station that I use, but typically don't use it that often, especially for stuff like this. But the little handheld vacuum suckers, I've got one of them, but I never use it. It just doesn't seem to work that well. There. So old and new. Looking at the board, you can also tell this is the only dual pot in terms of the two in the same case. All the other remaining ones on here are just a single. So for at least the 303, this is the only stereo pot on the actual unit. And that's it. Repair complete. Just need to reassemble the unit now. So one thing I just noticed when I'm looking at this is that this potentiometer I replaced is actually not identical replacement. It's got slightly more threads on there on this portion of it, and it's slightly taller. This is right around 1 3/16 inches tall, whereas the one next to it is a little around 1 1/8, a little bit shorter than 1 1/8. So checking the way the knobs sit on these, this volume pot's going to sit up a little bit higher than the rest of them. That's going to bug me. So unfortunately I already soldered it in. I could remove it and then cut the shaft down, which is probably what I should do, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to cut it down in place. I'm going to hold this with a small vise on my bench. I'll probably just take my Dremel to it, cover the rest of it with cloth just so I don't get any dust on there or anything, and just take about I don't know, maybe 1/8 or so off of there. I'll measure and actually get it right, but yeah, I'm going to have to cut that. That's going to drive me nuts otherwise. Alright, I've got it cut down now, so it's roughly the same size as the rest, which should solve that problem. Again, I probably should have removed it and done it that way, but I've got a small vise. I was able to just, with a small block, get in there and hold this, just so you're not putting any stress on the pot or the board itself. And from there, I ended up just using a small handsaw and just slowly, very gently cutting the top portion of that off, so it'll be fine. Okay, so now I'm just going to take a look at each of the main boards in this MC-303 to get a little bit closer look at it. So the actual main, as they call it here, Roland MC-303 panel board, just contains all of your micro switches and LEDs basically, along with the pots at the top there to control it. So there's not too much going on this board. I want to note too, there is a rotary encoder here. This, I've seen other units go bad. I don't know the part number offhand, but it is an easy replacement too. Just a couple pins on there, 4 pins, and the 2 reinforcement pins as well. So I also want to note that all the micro switch buttons on here, the tactile buttons, are the same as on the JV80. They're the exact same switch. In this case, a Panasonic type switch. I'll throw the data sheet up in case you need to replace any of those. I ended up replacing every single one of these buttons on my JV80 because a handful of them are going bad. Again, I don't know the hours of the usage on it. It seemed kind of unusual, but these are simple to replace. Just 2-pin little micro switches, tactile switches that are simple. But besides that, there's some logic in the bottom just to control all the scanning for the matrices on for all the switch detection and LEDs as well. But that's it for this board. So here's the main board out of the Roland MC-303. And this board's a little bit more interesting, really the only interesting board in the entire unit, which is pretty amazing given the complexity of this and everything you can do, that they squeezed everything into this one, for the time, relatively small board. So this board is labeled MC-303. It was only used in 303. I don't believe they used it anywhere else, although a lot of the integrated circuits in here are common across a lot of the Roland family of equipment. So like most Roland gear that I've seen, at least, a lot of the chips are labeled Roland. So again, they're fabricating their own silicon or having someone do it for them, custom made for their very purposes for this gear. So starting down here, this chip is actually the microprocessor in the unit. It's a Fujitsu MB90705H. I can't find very much information on that processor, other than that it was also used in the A series of MIDI controllers, which Roland had in their catalog about the same time that the MC-303 came out, roughly 1996-97. So that must have just been their CPU of choice at the time. Again, I can't even find a datasheet on it, so it's kind of an obscure part. Moving along the bottom here, this NEC chip, the D63200, that is actually the DAC. So I was wrong. The DAC is on the digital board in this case, not on the analog board. This is a dual 18-bit DAC, relatively decent specs from what I can tell. The only datasheet I can find is in Japanese, so it's kind of hard to extrapolate all the information out of it. But it's a trend that they've moved from. Typically, they always used Burr-Brown DA converters in at least everything I've taken apart that was a little bit older than this unit. So I don't know what the reasoning to go to that NEC chip was, but it's in there nonetheless. Moving along over here, we got these two Roland branded chips. This chip, the R15-239-229, I've seen this before in other pieces of Roland equipment. I remember trying to look up information on it. There's not very much information out there. Very proprietary to Roland, based on the design and what's on this board. This is most likely their, I don't want to call it DSP, but possibly their effects processor, possibly their actual ROM, audio playback chip. Basically, all the sound generation is going through this and then is outputting to the digital analog converter. It's also tied directly to a lot of RAM. So we have this Toshiba TC55257 DFL here, dash 70. The 70 is a dash giveaway for 70 nanosecond, which is the read time typically for a static RAM chip. We also have two more static RAMs over here. These are Samsung labeled integrated circuits. Again, dash 7, so 70 millisecond access time on those. They're both, fed directly off of this chip, so it has to do with the processing that's going on right there. Lastly, there's this Roland chip here, which I'm not able to get much information on. Again, Roland proprietary. There's not, at least from the searching I've done, I can't find any actual specs on it. So note that date codes on these chips as well. They're all roughly around 1996, 97, so 5th week of 97 on the CPU there. On the DAC, 25th week of 97. So this tells me that my MC-303 was probably one of the later models, since it came out in 96. There's a way to actually check to see what ROM firmware you have on here with a key combination on the front panel. I'll have to do that too once I have it all back together, because I'm actually kind of curious now. This guy here is our crystal, 24 megahertz, that giveaway says on the board. And then these two chips over here are most likely our ROMs. They're actually labeled with some jumpers on the board here, 4 meg, 4 meg, 8 meg. So, and I believe the specs on the MC-303 was it had 8 meg of sample RAM for all the actual samples of the various equipment that they recorded into it. Everything in this is basically recorded as PCM too, so it's just straight. I don't remember the exact specs in terms of the bit depth of the PCM samples they used, but 8 megs of it was quite a bit at the time. All the Roland SR-JV expansion modules themselves had 8 megs apiece on there, so they fit quite a bit of information into this individual MC-303 in the RAM. Lastly, just your typical Sierra 2032 battery. I tested it, it's fine. If it ever goes bad, you just buy any 3-volt lithium and replace it. No big deal. Pretty much every piece of Roland gear I've seen uses the same battery, and luckily they always socket it, which is nice, so it makes it easy to replace. Compared to some other manufacturers, Alesis for example, at least a couple of pieces of gear I've worked with them, their batteries are usually soldered in, which is kind of a pain. That's it for this board though. On the back side there's nothing. So that is it for the digital board. We'll take a look at the last analog board here in a second. Here is the last board in the MC-303, as Roland calls it, the jack board, which is pretty accurate to its name. It's just basically a handful of op amps and all your audio outputs. So not too much component wise on here. There's a handful of op amps which are NEC C4570C. Those are very low noise, high quality op amps. Roland actually uses them in a ton of their gear. I've seen them before. I believe you can still even source them today. I have to check on that. I'm not entirely sure though. Besides that, simple power supply section over here. Looks like we got a 7805 and a small heatsink directly tied to your voltage input from your small power transformer. Capacitors are Sanyo branded, 85C rated. Nothing special, but nothing in here is really going to get hot, so capacitor failure from this power supply isn't really going to be a big deal. So just power switch, handful of 1/4 inch jacks. Your MIDI interface, it's opto isolator, coupled just for protection to your circuitry there. 7404. So nothing special. So that is it for the Roland MC-303. So reassembly is pretty simple. It goes the opposite way you took it apart. Again, with the plastic buttons here, make sure you keep them in the proper orientation that they came out of. There's a couple little gotchas, like this one here. Actually doesn't sit like the rest, it flips upside down. Because that button, which is this one, actually lives a little bit higher. So if you be really careful when you take it apart, just take a picture if you have to, in case you're worried about mixing them all up, because it can be kind of a pain to align these all up and get them back in. But that's it. So you just drop the main board back in. That and screw it down. I've got it propped up just with a couple screwdrivers here too, just so the buttons aren't laying face first on my bench here, putting pressure back up on this board so it didn't line up quite correctly. The main CPU board is next. Last is the replacement of the output board. All the knobs look level, so I'm happy about that. Power up. They look good. And I don't have any speakers here to test it with. I'll hook a headphone up and make sure it works, but I'm pretty confident at that point that we're going to be okay. To check the firmware version on the MC-303, you press and hold Shift, Scale, and R. And you can see I've got version 1.03, which was actually the latest version made for the MC-303. 1.00 was the earliest, followed by 1.01, 1.02. 1.03 is supposedly the most stable version, being the last version they made before this unit ended production. So this is a late model, which I kind of guessed based on the date codes in the chips, which is cool. So I am happy with that. I will throw the back or the bottom cover on and test it with headphones, but I think we'll be good at this point. So there's a look inside the Roland MC-303. Pretty simple to work on, nothing too special. If you ever have any pots go bad, it's pretty simple to replace them. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.